Today, I'm simplifying our tariffs in steel and aluminum so that everyone can understand exactly what it means. It's 25% without exceptions or exemptions, and that's all countries, no matter where it comes from.
I think it'll have a dramatic effect on Canada, and it's going to force Canada to take a stand like the U.S. is taking. And Canada needs to push the imports that come into Canada out to create a robust Canadian market where Canadian steel can be consumed in Canada and pushed out, just like the U.S. is trying to do.
Canadian producers could try and sell more inside Canada instead of exporting, but they might have to survive a big drop in revenue, and Canada just doesn't have as many potential customers as the U.S., Ian.
Hey, imagine waking up to find that the very market keeping your economy afloat has just slammed its doors shut overnight. That's exactly what Canada faced on June 4th, when tariffs on its steel and aluminum exports to the United States doubled from 25% to a crushing 50%. For an industry where 9 out of every 10 shipments cross the border, the message was unmistakable. America was no longer open for business. Within weeks, industry associations declared bluntly that the U.S. market was effectively closed, and more than 1,000 jobs had already vanished in just the first 3 months under the new tariffs. In Hamilton, Ontario, the symbolic heart of Canada's steel belt, workers whispered about a looming tsunami of layoffs that could sweep through entire communities. The real question is, how did one policy decision unleash such an earthquake in Canada's economy, and what does it mean for the families caught in the middle? Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button. A simple like helps push this video to more people who need to see it. And the shock didn't stop there. If the overnight tariff hike was the earthquake, then the aftershocks came in the form of Canada's suffocating dependency on the U.S. market. More than 90% of Canadian steel and aluminum exports used to flow south across the border. With the door now locked, that lifeline has all but disappeared, turning a policy shift into what many companies describe as an economic death sentence. For smaller firms, the impact was immediate and brutal. Entrepreneurs like Rahim Malou saw their entire U.S. customer base vanish almost overnight. Contracts canceled not because of poor performance, but because the threat of tariffs made every deal impossible to sustain. Larger players weren't spared either. Fusion TG, a mid-sized manufacturer, reported its sales plunging by 1/3 in just the first quarter after the tariff hike. Across the country, the ripple effects grew louder. From the processing plants of Montreal to fabrication shops in Alberta, managers began cutting shifts, slashing hours, and quietly drawing up layoff lists. The question was no longer whether jobs would be lost, but how many communities would be hollowed out before new markets could be found. Still with us? Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's next. But retaliation, instead of offering relief, only deepened the strain. Faced with vanishing markets and mounting layoffs, Ottawa reached for the only weapon it believed it had: counter-tariffs. A 25% duty was slapped on $30 billion worth of U.S. goods, from household staples to industrial inputs, in an attempt to show strength. Yet the move raised a painful question: who was really paying the price? Ontario Premier Doug Ford went even further, tacking an additional electricity surcharge onto exports bound for the U.S., a decision that quickly fed back into higher costs for Canadian producers themselves. The results were predictable. Surveys revealed that nearly 1 in 5 Canadian businesses admitted they were directly harmed by their own government's retaliation. Instead of denting American industry, the measures chipped away at Canada's fragile recovery, leaving firms with even fewer options to stay afloat. Financial markets noticed as well. The Toronto Stock Exchange slid more than 3% after Trump's re-election, and the wave of retaliatory tariffs, signaling not just investor caution, but a deeper erosion of confidence in Canada's economic direction. And beneath all the policy maneuvers, it was ordinary workers who felt the blow most directly. From the factory floor to the union halls, everyone understood the same harsh truth. The real cost of this trade war was measured in lost jobs. Canada's manufacturing base is tied at the hip to U.S. demand, with nearly 688,000 positions, about 41% of the sector's entire workforce, dependent on cross-border orders. When that demand dried up, the fallout was swift. Companies like Canada Metal Processing had no choice but to issue pink slips, cutting 140 jobs in a single round of layoffs. Unions rang the alarm as well. The United Steelworkers warned that up to 100,000 of its members could be directly affected, a figure that underscored just how exposed Canadian labor had become. In Hamilton, Ontario, once a proud symbol of industrial stability, anxiety spread like wildfire. Families spoke of waiting for the next cut, unsure whether their turn would come tomorrow, next week, or in the next round of plant closures. For communities built on steel, the sense of security had evaporated almost overnight. While Canada was tightening the noose on its own economy, south of the border the picture looked strikingly different. For Donald Trump, the tariff gamble quickly crystallized into both a political and economic victory. On the campaign trail, he had promised to restore American steel, and within weeks of the new duties, early indicators suggested that promise was being fulfilled. Cleveland-Cliffs Inc., one of the country's largest producers, saw its stock price jump by 26% immediately after the announcement, a powerful signal that investors viewed the tariffs not as a drag but as a catalyst for renewed growth. Orders that had once trickled in suddenly surged, allowing domestic mills to bring back shifts, restart furnaces, and reactivate production lines that had been mothballed for years. Communities that had grown accustomed to shuttered plants and idle smokestacks began to see signs of activity again, a change that carried symbolic weight far beyond the balance sheet. Trump, never shy about framing economic policy in personal terms, doubled down on his narrative. Tariffs will force factories to build right here in America, and the economy will boom, he declared, positioning the policy not as a temporary measure, but as proof of his America First doctrine. By presenting protectionism as patriotism, he strengthened his political capital while reinforcing a sense of industrial pride among workers. For voters across the Rust Belt, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, the shift was more than numbers on a chart. It felt like vindication after decades of plant closures, layoffs, and foreign competition that had eroded their way of life. For the first time in years, they could point to tangible evidence that Washington was defending their livelihoods rather than sacrificing them. Jobs were staying home, investment was flowing back, and in local conversations from union halls to diners, the consensus was that Canadian imports were no longer threatening their paychecks. In that light, the contrast could not have been sharper. As Ottawa scrambled to contain the damage, Washington projected confidence, and Trump could credibly argue that his hardline approach was delivering results where previous administrations had only made promises. But the impact didn't stop at raw steel and aluminum. It rippled outward into industries whose very foundations rested on those metals. The auto sector, long considered a bedrock of both economies, was among the first to stagger under the weight. Ford Motor Company publicly admitted it had to shoulder hundreds of millions of dollars in additional costs just to secure aluminum from Canadian suppliers, a blow that complicated already razor-thin profit margins and forced executives to reevaluate production schedules. Suppliers faced their own bruising reality. Alcoa, one of America's largest aluminum producers, disclosed that it had absorbed $115 million in tariff payments to continue sourcing material from Quebec. The irony was hard to miss. A policy designed to strengthen domestic industry ended up inflating expenses even for the companies it was supposed to protect, creating a paradox of rising costs within a supposedly shielded market. Labor organizations, watching from the shop floor, were quick to sound the alarm. Unifor, which represents tens of thousands across auto and aerospace, warned that the consequences could reach far beyond metalworkers. If pressures continued, layoffs would not be confined to smelters and foundries. They could cascade into assembly plants, maintenance hubs, and aviation facilities, destabilizing industries that had long been seen as cornerstones of industrial strength. In Canada, the pinch revealed itself in a different but equally painful form: construction. Higher input costs pushed housing developments, transport corridors, and energy projects over budget. Municipalities postponed new infrastructure, and private developers scaled back ambitions, forcing contractors and suppliers to idle equipment and reduce payrolls. What began as a tariff dispute on metals had, in effect, turned into a systemic drag, slowing the pulse of an economy already struggling to breathe. By the end of the quarter, economists began warning that the shock was no longer confined to a single sector. The chain reaction was spreading into finance, logistics, and even consumer confidence, underscoring a sobering reality. No corner of the economy was fully insulated from the wave unleashed by tariffs. Faced with a locked U.S. market, Canadian businesses began searching for escape routes wherever they could find them. Europe and Asia quickly became the natural targets, markets large enough to absorb at least part of the displaced output. But replacing America's sheer scale was never going to be simple. For decades, Canadian exporters had built supply chains, logistics corridors, and customer relationships almost exclusively around the southern border. When that door slammed shut, the alternatives, however attractive on paper, came with hurdles of cost, regulation, and time. Surveys showed that nearly 44% of exporters who once relied heavily on U.S. buyers were already knocking on doors outside North America, hoping to stitch together new client lists. Some firms even committed to physical footprints, establishing offices in Europe or Asia to prove their seriousness and secure long-term contracts. In strategy decks, it looked decisive. In reality, these ventures burned cash quickly and required patience that many smaller firms simply didn't have. That left many caught in a painful limbo, pouring resources into global expansion while revenues shrank at home. Freight costs spiked, compliance with unfamiliar standards ate into margins, and the lag between outreach and signed contracts stretched months, even years. Investors noticed the strain, pulling back on support for firms seen as overexposed to foreign risk. By mid-year, confidence across the business community had begun to fade. Polling revealed that more than 60% of Canadian companies expected instability to worsen in the coming 12 months. It was a sobering acknowledgement that diversification, while necessary, was no silver bullet. The speed of the U.S. market's closure had far outpaced Canada's ability to reinvent its trade map, leaving the country suspended between ambition abroad and uncertainty at home. In the end, the picture couldn't be clearer. While Trump tightened the screws to rebuild American industry, Canada paid the price in lost jobs, lost markets, and lost credibility. What began as retaliation under Prime Minister Mark Carney soon looked more like self-inflicted damage, a textbook case of shooting itself in the foot. Not only did Canada watch profits evaporate, it also surrendered its long-standing position as America's top steel and aluminum supplier. From the outside, the paradox was striking. Ottawa appeared weaker with every counterpunch, while Washington looked stronger for standing its ground. The lingering question is whether Canada can still find a way to adapt, or if this moment marks the start of a long slide into industrial irrelevance. And that leads us to you. How do you see it? Was this simply a short-term shock Canada can recover from, or the beginning of a permanent shift in North America's balance of power? If this video gave you something to think about, like and subscribe to support more content like this. Thank you.